Thank you for joining us this morning. We are in the book of Ezra. And give me 1 second here to pull one other thing up so I'll have it, because I printed it and sent it downstairs and then got busy talking to folks and never went down and picked it up. So I'll just have to bring it up on the screen here in a few minutes. But we're working on this book of Ezra where we introduced it a couple of Sundays ago. We dove into chapter 1 last week for a little while, just trying to get a little bit of the history and trying to learn from them a little bit about the obligations and responsibilities that they took on as it relates to the challenges. We're going to see more challenges as it relates to the work that God has intended for them to come back out of captivity and out of exile and back into the promised land to be able to begin to rebuild, first and foremost, the temple, right? We need to get worship up and running. It's going to take them longer than it should have, but eventually they'll accomplish that, and then we'll start securing the city and reestablishing authority and rule and those kinds of things. But lots of work ahead in relationship to those who are coming out of exile and captivity from Babylonians to the Persians, and now Cyrus is going to send them back, as was prophesied, right? We talked about that last week, that both Isaiah and Jeremiah talk about the fact that Cyrus would come into power, and when that happens, that's the end of the captivity, and he will send the people back into Judah and into Jerusalem to begin to reestablish God's people there. But before we get back into the study, if you would, let's bow our heads together and let's share in a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, thank you for the opportunity that we have to gather today, to open our Bibles together and to appreciate the testimony of your word. Thank you for the promises found in it. Thank you for the encouragement, the hope that we learned that though you needed to address the challenges of your people and their transgressions against you, that you still offered them hope and promise and returned and restored them back to your promised land. Strengthen us in our study today. Help us to gain benefit, not only to understand the history, but to understand the lessons from these individuals who strove to come back and to begin to honor you again. Thank you again for the day you blessed us with, and it's through your Son's name that we pray. Amen. All right, so just refresh and remember. So Cyrus is in charge, right? He's the Persian king that's in charge. Who's the first guy going back? Zerubbabel. We talked last week that there's another name that comes up. I made the argument from a couple of passages that it's the same guy, but who's that? There's another name. Sheshbazzar, right? Sheshbazzar or Sheshbazzar, and I believe I believe that's just a Babylonian name for Zerubbabel, and I think we showed you two texts that spoke about the same work being done by Zerubbabel in one text and by Sheshbazzar in another text, which kind of makes us understand maybe that we're talking about one and the same. It doesn't have to be that way. Yeah, everything seems to point to that, although there's always those anomaly scholars who just are determined that it's got to be a different guy or it's got to be just somebody completely different. But that's what I believe to be true as it relates to who this Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah, there in verse 8 of our text. And so this process begins by the decree of Cyrus. Zerubbabel's going to lead this first wave of folks to go back. And what do the people of God have to do? Let me rephrase the question. The first thing they have to do is decide what? Whether they're going or not, right? That's the first decision they have to make, whether they're going or not. Once they do that, then there is, I think, a twofold economic, monetary responsibility. One is compulsory. I think you can read from that text that there are certain requirements that everybody was going to contribute to the efforts and work and the time period it would take for this travel to occur, the necessary resources to not only make the trip, but to start to do the work once they got there. And all of those who were in exile and captives there in Babylon were going to have to, by compulsory, contribute to that. Then there was a second offering called the what? Free will, right? There was a second description, one mandatory in a sense, the other free will. So there's things provided by obligation, then things provided by free will. That brings us to where we are in our study. Then there's the resources provided by whom? By the king, by Cyrus. Okay, so you've got your funding, if you will, for this travel coming from three different sources. One comes from the obligation of the Israelites that were exiled. The second was the free will offering that came from that same group of people. And the third is what the king himself provides. So notice it, beginning in verse 9. He tells his treasurer and numbers these things out to Sheshbazzar or Zerubbabel. And this is the number of them: 30 chargers of gold, 1,000 chargers of silver, 9 and 20 knives, 30 basins of gold, silver basins of a second sort, 410, and other vessels 1,000. All the vessels of gold and of silver were 5,400. All these did Sheshbazzar bring up with them of the captivity that were brought up from Babylon. So basically, he's giving them the monetary means by which to fulfill the obligation that who gave him? That God gave him, right? God, in some senses, doesn't necessarily give Cyrus a choice here. Obviously, he's a free moral agent. He can make his choices, but this is the instructions that God has given for him to take care of this in light of the benefit that God brought to him in being able to win these victories and conquer these other nations. So he sends them back with a lot of things of value. Anybody got an estimate? Did anybody look that up, by the way? Take a look at this amount of gold and silver and the things that were offered and try to come up with a contemporary estimate of about how much that would be. Now, I would never ask that question if I didn't, by the way. Nobody, and I'm not saying you had to, I didn't ask you to, but so the challenge in it is, by the way, that we don't know how much the gold and silver weighed. That's the challenge, because we don't necessarily know the level of purity that right. There are factors that aren't here that hinder a little bit of getting a very precise contemporary comparison. But the argument generally is this is somewhere between $2 to $5 million worth of value, contemporary. If you were going to compare that, what gold and silver was worth in those days and today, roughly a $2 to $5 million, depending on the weight of all this and the purity of it all, amount. So a pretty significant amount of monetary funding that Cyrus provides to the people in order for them to go back and fulfill the purposes that God had commanded them and him to go and fulfill. So they leave Babylonian captivity with a significant amount of resources. That which was compulsory given by the Israelites, that which was free will given by the Israelites, and that which was given by the hand of the treasurer out of Cyrus's command and dictate that they receive this gold and silver and these other items that they're going to take back. And so they are leaving with a significant monetary ability to go and fulfill the purposes that God has for them. Kind of scary when you think about it, to be traveling along, right, with a highly significant amount of money. I've told you all maybe once before, years ago, when Hurricane Katrina went through New Orleans and those areas, and I can remember that I went down and drove a truck in a convoy of trucks that went down and taking provisions down for folks, and it was highly nerve-wracking because within the convoy of trucks and the monetary cash and things, it was nearly $250,000 that we had in the 8 trucks and the cash that we had on us driving down here into this area with who knows what, right? And so it was concerning. And my illustration is simply to point out it's nerve-wracking, right? Here they are, and they're going to be traveling through all kinds of areas and regions to try to get back down. Not an easy trip, and they're going to have on them quite a bit of wealth, and so there's issues that they're going to have to overcome as they make that trip. Thoughts about chapter 1 before I...
But it was going to take some means, personally, for people to go back. Was there like a sorting out of things going on there too, that the poor were going to have to stay back there? They wouldn't have the resources to go.
Yeah, or have to use the resources provided to be able to go. It would have been, and we don't have a lot of that detail, because what we have in chapter 2 is really just kind of a numbering, a census. But it is an interesting thought to think about the varying ways that people would have made their decisions. And some would have had more means to be able to help. Some would have had the means to be able to provide for their own travel in some senses, others not. So there would have had to have been a sorting out of some of those kinds of challenges.
Right, I thought about something. We're going to go back to Jerusalem, but it's been 70 years.
Yeah.
How many people that were in captivity really knew what it was like back? Probably not very many. Well,
Yeah.
most of them had died off.
So you're most likely talking about a younger group whose knowledge is either highly limited, and most of that knowledge would have just come from what they were taught and what was shared with them as it relates to those things.
When we looked ahead and we talked about, when they finally got back, Ezra's crew, now they asked him to read the law. It makes you wonder how much was actually passed down from those older generations, and how many people of those older generations would have been there, because there must have been at least a decent amount of people who had been taught not just the history of Jerusalem and everything else, but also enough of the law to where when they got back they had that conviction to allow them to want to stand up and to have the law read to them.
And I think we'll see in the listing, in the census, that there was a real serious effort being made to make sure that the priesthood and those kinds of things were intact in the proper ways. And I think we'll see that coming up. So just real quick then, whoops, showed you the wrong thing. There we go. So go to your lesson sheets and use those review questions real quick if you have those sheets on you. And want to go through and review those, use these review questions that are in those lesson sheets. So what prophecy of Jeremiah did Cyrus, king of Persia, fulfill? That they would go back, right? And he would be responsible to make sure that happened. And I guess that's kind of the answer to question 2 as well, is what command did God give him? Yeah, go back and rebuild. You're going to send these people, and they're going to and you're going to provide the resources and the things necessary in order to accomplish that. What was to be given? I keep answering the questions ahead. What was to be given to the people returning to Jerusalem? Yeah, provision, right? That things necessary to go back. What did Cyrus give to Sheshbazzar, the prince of Judah? Yeah, a lot of monetary value, right? And we just talked a moment ago about the estimate of how much he had provided. And then, who actually went with Sheshbazzar to Jerusalem? And that's a general answer at this point. Yeah, and who, the exiles who wanted to go, right? I think that's key in this. That there's nobody being forced to go back into Jerusalem. This is going to have to be their decision, their choice, to decide to go back to the homeland and rebuild what God intended for them in that place. All right, so let's jump into chapter 2, and chapter 2 we can maybe move through a little bit quickly, because I've never been one to go around the room and make you read verses, but I'm tempted, right, when we start going through these names, to let you guys fight your way through it rather than me. So I don't intend to necessarily read that. I'm going to look at these in chunks, these groups of individuals. But just notice at the beginning here. Now these are the children of the province that went up out of the captivity of those which had been carried away, whom Nebuchadnezzar the king of Babylon had carried away unto Babylon, and came again unto Jerusalem and Judah, and every one unto his city, which came with Zerubbabel. So here's the first list. How would you describe this first list of names? Well, no. Well, thanks for jumping to the obvious, Bill. So beyond being able to say them, who are they? That's what I'm asking. Okay, so the first grouping that we have that are enumerated are, and you're not going to be able to read that very well on the screen, but this is more for me because I forgot to print it, or I did print it, didn't go downstairs and get it. But the first group that are enumerated are the leaders. That verse 2 is going to tell us about those who were the leaders that came out of the captivity and would have the responsibility to oversee then these various pockets of people and the various needs that will come up. The first grouping are the leaders. From verses 3 through 19, those folks that are listed in those verses are named by their families, okay? So from verses 3 through 19, again, I won't challenge any of us to try to pronounce all of those correctly. My grandfather, my mom's dad would tell me anytime he was in a Bible class and couldn't read a word, he just called it Pittsburgh. But anyway, so instead of saying Pittsburgh 45 times today, we'll just note that here's the men, right? So from verses 3 through 19, they number them by families. And you see in the children of Parosh, the children of Sheph, see, I can't even get to number 2 and saying it right. And they show us not just the name of that family, but the what? The number, right? The census. I just want you to notice, just notice an example. So of the very first family numbered there in verse 3, 2,172. That's interesting to me. Number one, that's a big family. Good luck getting them around Thanksgiving dinner table, right? That's a big family. Number one. Number two, what I notice about it, and he does this throughout, and you don't always get this when you're dealing with censuses in the Bible. A lot of times when we get census numbers, what we get are what we would call rounded numbers, right? Sometimes you get very general kind of rounded numbers. They didn't do that here. They seem to be being very precise in their numbering and naming of the people. So let me just ask the question at the outset. We could have waited till we worked through it, or we could do it now. Why do this? What's the reason? I mean, why not just, if you're Ezra and you're writing these things, why not just say, here's how many people came back? Why do you think he's being so specific about giving us, at this, for the first 16 verses here, the names of the families and the precise number of people that came? What do you think the reasoning for that is? Okay, so genealogy is very peculiarly important to the Israelites because their promises are all attached to lineage, right? Think about it. When the Pharisees, even in Jesus' day, centuries later from this, when he brings challenge to them, they said, "We are of Abraham's seed." They're still walking and trusting in promises that were connected to lineage. And so they are very, very much engaged. And so I think Ezra here does this so that we have this accurate record of who it was, what were the families, how many of those people came out. Sometimes it was large, like 2,172. Sometimes maybe a little smaller, like the next group of 372. And you keep going, and there's variations among these families of how large a size of these family groupings that come out of the Babylonian captivity and begin to head back down towards the promises that God had intended back in Jerusalem. So through verse 19, I believe what we have are the listings based on family. From verses 20 through 35, they change. And they begin to have a discussion about where these people were from. So the first group of listings and numbering of the people happened based on family. The second set of numberings come from where the people were from. Notice verse 21, the children of Bethlehem. Right? And all these others, and if you think the names are hard to pronounce in terms of people, the cities are just as bad. So it's just as hard. And these numbers tend to be a little what? A little smaller. So let me ask a second question. So why the need to make this change then? Why couldn't they get everybody just listed under a family? They may not know, right? They may have been able to evidence where they were from, but they may not, after 70 years of captivity, there may not be anybody enough around to be able to evidence who they're from. But they could evidence where they were from. And so there's a smaller grouping of people who begin to be enumerated based on where they're from that they could evidence. And I believe that runs clear down through about verse 35 of that kind of numbering.
Talked about everyone to his own city. So these people are going to be spread out into what had been their cities prior.
Right. And so you would be able to identify where they were from based on where they assimilated when they were in exile, right? And because they kind of stayed together. The third group, verses 36 through 39, are the who. That's the priests, okay? And the priests are numbered separately, and that's going to be an important aspect of what they're doing here. Because if your main purpose is to get back to Jerusalem, first priority, get the what? Get the temple built and get worship to God going again. And if we're going to do that right, we've got to have proper priesthood. And they've got to be able to evidence that they're of that lineage, that they came ultimately from whom? Aaron, right? They've got to be able to evidence that. And so we've got a group of priests that were proven to be such that are going to go back with this first wave that goes back to the promised land. They number then identify the first wave as priests. In verses 40 through 42, they number and name them as Levites of that tribe then, right? And so some are evidence that were part of the priest. Others, very specifically, the Levites, and among them will be folks that had certain roles, right? Here are the singers in verse 41, the children of Asaph. You see some of the Psalms. If you go back, you'll see noted that Asaph was the author of those Psalms. There's the porters and those various ones that served in various ways in the temple. That's who the Nethinims are, verse 43, right? Those were the temple servants. And so you're going to number those folks who are part of that lineage so that when you come back, I've got priesthoods, I got the Levites in their various roles between porters and singers, and now I've got the Nethinims who are going to, the servants of the temple. I'm just making sure, in a sense, that I have all the things necessary to make that possible. So the families of the Nethinim, those servants of the temple, they're noted clear through verse 54. Verse 55, you have what are noted as the children of Solomon's servants. Now that's kind of interesting, right? Because now we're backing up to the last time that the kingdom was what? United, right? We're taking the servants that come out of the lineage of those who were the servants of Solomon back the last time there was a united front when it came to God's people. And so you see those numbers happen through verse 57. Then beginning in verse 58, let me slow down now for a minute. So all the Nethinims and the children of Solomon's servants were 392. So he combines that servant group together, if you will. The Nethinims, servants of the temple, Solomon's, numbers them all together. And then these were they which went up from Telmaiah, but they couldn't do what? Verse 59 says. There was no evidence that they could use to undeniably know that they were Israelites. That's going to be a problem because of think about it. What are we doing here? We're numbering and we're creating this census and we're evidencing what family did it belong to, or at least what city did it belong to. Did they belong to a Levite group or a priestly group? Right? We're making all this effort, and now all of a sudden we've got some folks that showed up and said, I want to go. And they said, well, what's your tie? And they couldn't come up with one. And so here were these individuals that created a challenge to try to figure out what do you do and how do you account for those who couldn't necessarily show or evidence. And so they noted those individuals in through verse 63. Note verse 62. These sought their register among those that were reckoned by genealogy, but they were not found. Therefore were they, as polluted, put from the priesthood. So they appear to be numbered in the sense that they were allowed to what? They were allowed to go. But if you can't prove that you're part of the priesthood, you're not going as part of the priesthood. You may claim it, but if you can't evidence it, because when we get back to Jerusalem, we want to do this right. We want to do this right. And so there's a great lesson there for us in all this detail and this fast way we've looked at this chapter. But if it's God's work, it's worth doing. It's worth doing right. It's worth doing right. They had, the whole reason they were in captivity was because they didn't do it. They weren't doing it right? They weren't honoring what God really wanted from them. And it got to such an extent that God says, okay, I'm done. I'm going to have to deal with them in such a way that helps them learn a lesson And so when you return, you don't want to bring the same bad habits and the same challenges and the same difficulties that caused the problem to begin with. And so they're very, very cautious to make sure that they have the correct priesthood and lineage of priests in line. So they tell these folks, you're not going to serve in those particular ways as it relates to that. So the whole congregation together, verse 64, was 42,303 score. 42,360. Yeah, right. So that's a large number. Yeah. They need a temple, right? That's right. That's the next verse, right? That's just the numbering of people that could be identified as legitimately part of the lineage. Besides that number, there were their servants and their maids, of whom there were 7,337, and there were among them 200 singing men and singing women. I always found that fascinating, but in some ways, but it's also, I don't know, it's an interesting little piece of history that music has been part of the human fabric for ever, in some senses, right? So much so that long before the radio and the phonograph and long before the cassette tape and the 8-track and the MP3 and right, all that, what'd they have? They had traveling singers, right? And I guess if you're going to make the trek from way up in the north, where you'd been taken into captivity and exile, and you're going to travel all the way back down to Jerusalem, it wouldn't be a bad thing to have a little music along the way, right? A little entertainment along the way. Plus, they're going to be crucial in what? In the temple worship when you reestablish it. That music is a very integral part to the human fabric and to the worship towards God early on. And I think it's valuable for us to appreciate that here. That when they come back out of captivity, they very peculiarly note how many singers they brought with them to fulfill those purposes. And then they note the resources, right? The horses, the mules, the camels, the donkeys, right? All the things necessary to make it possible. Now, I'm going to pause, and I'll come back next Sunday. There went the bell. I knew that was going to happen. But I want you to think about one thing before we close. And you look this up, and you come back Sunday, and let's see if we can find a resolve. There's an interesting challenge, and anytime the Bible presents an interesting challenge, I try to just look at it. You can try to act like it doesn't exist, or you can deal with it. I want you to look at Nehemiah chapter 7. And I want you to see whether there's something peculiar about what Nehemiah does in chapter 7 and what happened just right here in Ezra chapter 2. Knowing that Nehemiah came later. Nehemiah comes later. But I want you to go look at chapter 7 and see if there's anything interesting about the chapter 7 of Nehemiah and chapter 2 of Ezra. And let's see if we can't resolve that